Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you guys are doing okay today. Let's go with some green checks to start, and then we'll get into this. We have a bunch of stuff I want to get through today, and could take a few minutes, so we'll get going right away. The first thing I wanted to ask was, last day we kind of finished up Unit 2, and I wanted to see if anybody, Unit 3. I wanted to see if anybody had any questions specific to the learning guide in Unit 3 that you wanted me to go over. I know a few of you submitted it already, and a few of you still need to submit that. So if you have anything, questions came up, anything, I know it was fairly straightforward. This biology stuff's not terribly process-oriented. It's just kind of, vocab and remembering stuff. So if everyone's kind of okay with the learning guide, I'll jump into Unit 10. And remember, we're going into Unit 10 because we can get it done before spring break. And it's just, it doesn't really fit anywhere else really great. So it's kind of why I was hoping we can get it done before the break. Then after the break, we'll jump into chemistry, Unit 4, 5, and 6. And that leaves physics and a little bit of additional earth science. So perfect. All right, so that's good. Nobody has any pressing questions about Unit 3. I'm going to go through this Unit 10 stuff, and then I'll go back to the course and talk a little bit about how the next sort of week and a bit's going to look, and sort of expectations moving into the March break, and then we'll send you guys off for the day. So the first person we're going to talk about is Alfred Wegener. Now, normally when we are dealing in science, there's lots of really important scientists that have ideas, and we talk about their ideas. But generally speaking, you're not required to know, who they are, what they thought, sort of what they discovered, and things like that. This is kind of one of those exceptions where we're going to talk about 3 people today, and I don't love it, but unfortunately, you kind of need to know what the people's ideas were, and basically just kind of memorization. There's no other way to put it. So today we're going to talk about 3 people, and then you just need to know sort of their contributions to earth science. And that's what we're going to deal with, is earth science. We're talking about the earth now. Now, normally there's a big unit about earth science, and this big unit has stuff with like convection currents and things like that. We talk about weather and all this other stuff. But a long time ago, probably about 5 or so years ago, all of the convection in the atmosphere and stuff got taken off the provincial exam. So the government said, well, we're not going to test this particular section anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to not get to that stuff right now, convection in the atmosphere, weather. And if we have time at the very end of the course, I'll go over it. It's not going to be on the provincial exam, but it still technically needs to be taught. So it's kind of one of those things. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through it right now, just in case we run short on time at the end of the semester. So this sort of Unit 10 might seem a bit out of place, but keep in mind it's part of a bigger set of units about energy transfer and things like that. So that's why it kind of doesn't make as much sense as it could. So there's this guy, his name was Alfred Wegener, and he was basically a scientist about 100 or so years ago, and he came up with a theory, and he was basically looking at some maps of the world, and he said, well, those continents kind of look like puzzle pieces. I wonder if once upon a time they kind of fit together. So, he thought this, and then he started to do a little bit more digging and saying, well, is there any other things that would lead us to believe that the continents were all together at one time? And he came up with this theory, and he tried to find as much evidence to support it as he could. So we'll talk about his evidence, and then we'll talk about why his ideas weren't, taken seriously until he essentially died. After he died, then people started saying, you know what, maybe this guy was onto something. Abby, I just saw your question in chat. I'll get to it at the end, and we'll talk about it when I jump into the course. So the Module 1 exam. Some of you guys are ready for that, but I'll talk about it later. So the continental shelves fit really well together, but of course he couldn't see that at the time. All he had was the outlines of the continents, because we didn't have satellites or anything, 150 years ago. So Wagner came up with some other evidence, matching geological features, matching fossils, and different climates than previously existed. So we'll look at each of these individually, and we'll just talk about Wagner's ideas. So the first idea that Wagner came up with was the continents fit together like a puzzle. And you can see the little picture beside me here is all of these continents were once, really jammed in together, kind of like that. And then they slowly moved apart. And this was his idea. Like the big three are North America, South America, and Africa. They fit together really well. Like if you had a puzzle, these three pieces would be, great to go together. I mean, the outline of North America on this coast here fits really well with the top of Africa. This bottom part of Africa fits really well with South America. There are some really weird things. If you watch this little island right here, watch where it goes. Let it run through. So that little island was once an island, but now it moves its way up here, and it is present-day India. So weird stuff. Antarctica and Australia used to be touching. So the idea is that, the things, all these continents look like they fit together. We're going to talk about that, Alex. That's what today's all about. So the second thing he started to look at was geological features. When we talk about geological features, we're talking about things like mountains and other things like that. So on the east coast of the United States and up through towards Canada, there's something called the Appalachian Mountains. And they're a very, very old mountain range. They're not big and jagged like the Rocky Mountains, because the Rocky Mountains are relatively young. So this is North America here. Here's Alaska. Here's Vancouver Island. Here's where we are in interior BC. So we're talking about the east coast of North America here, Africa. And then you can see over here, this is Europe over here. And, here's Finland and Sweden, Scandinavia up here. So he started looking at these mountain ranges, and he found that the Appalachian Mountains that run through the east coast of North America, the rock that made up those mountains was the exact same rock that existed in northern United Kingdom and into Scandinavia. So, and then there's also some evidence to suggest that type of rock, or that mountain range going up the east coast that ran right through Scandinavia, was also similar to the west coast of Africa. So there's a bunch of examples of this. You see all these red areas. So he found all of these geological features that kind of lined up if you put these pieces together like a puzzle, which was kind of interesting. So he said, okay, well, this is kind of the second piece of his sort of theory. Everything kind of fits together like a puzzle. There's really old mountain ranges that line up across continents. So if those continents developed a long ways apart, how could that mountain range of, join there? It didn't make sense. So he kept digging. He kept doing some research, and he kept looking. So by this time, kind of like late 1800s, I forget the dates exactly. So exactly, Anna. The mountains were once connected. They were a continuous mountain range, and then now they're separate. So the mountains kind of matched on different continents, which was weird. Another thing was fossils. So he started looking at fossil evidence of fossils existing on different places. So you can see this. I'm not even going to pretend to pronounce this. I will. Cygnognathus. I don't know. So this guy, he's a land-dwelling dinosaur. If his fossil was found in South America, which was completely separate from Africa, South America and Africa, you have a giant ocean in the way, the Atlantic Ocean. How could a land-dwelling dinosaur live on two separate continents? We know, we've learned some ideas about natural selection, adaptive radiation, and there was no really good explanation. I kid you not, up until this time, people thought that there was land bridges, like a bridge of land that went across the Atlantic Ocean, and the dinosaurs just walked across this bridge. I don't know how big it was or whatever, but anyways, people believed that they were once connected, and then erosion happened, and then the land bridges disappeared. So there's not just that one dinosaur. There's many. You end up with this other guy here. He lived in Africa, which was a long ways away from India, and then Antarctica. Like, really? There's fossils of dinosaurs in Antarctica? Yes, there is fossils of dinosaurs in Antarctica. So Antarctica, conceivably in the last 200 years, has been covered in snow and thick ice sheets. So how did that happen? And then the other thing is there's these sort of tropical leaves that are fossilized across Antarctica, Australia, across all of the continents. Now, it's a little bit more plausible that a plant could, move long distances, birds, seeds, things like that. That makes sense. But these dinosaurs that only lived on land, how could they possibly get across? And then like a freshwater dinosaur that lives in kind of lakes and things, how could it, swim across salt water? So this was another piece of evidence that he used. The fourth was paleoglaciation. So paleontologist or paleontology is the study of dinosaurs and fossils and things like that. So paleo, this root or the prefix paleo, just means the study of old things. So if we talk about paleoglaciation, we're talking about ancient glaciers. And we talked a little bit about how Okanagan Valley was carved out by glaciers. Well, it turns out that there's valleys from Antarctica and Africa and India, and all of these valleys kind of line up. So there was a big ice sheet that covered Antarctica, Australia, India, South Pole, South America, and there's glacier marks on all of these places. Think about this portion of Africa as like savanna, extremely dry, very hot. And same with India. India is a completely tropical climate. We're talking about tropical rainforest here for most of India. So how is it possible that there's glaciers on it? So there's evidence of glaciers carving out valleys, paleoglaciation. So these were all of the things that Wagner came up with. And he did a bunch of research and he found out this idea. So he came up with the idea that all the continents were once together, and he called it Pangaea. And like I said, nobody believed him. They said, Wagner, if all of this stuff is true, how do the continents move? And I think, Alex, you asked that question up. Yeah, how can we confirm this? And he couldn't. He could not come up with a way to suggest how these continents moved. So he just said, this is the evidence that I have. This is my theory. And I can't tell you how they got there or how they moved, but they were once together. He was certain of it. And again, nobody believed him until he died, and then we started to develop better technologies, and there's more evidence that we'll look at here in a second. So he called this supercontinent, kind of behind me here, Pangaea, and he came up with this idea. So I always love to think of it this way, but if these continents were moving or have been moving for millions of years, are they moving right now? Should they still be moving? And sometimes when students go through this section, they think, well, they were moving and then now they've stopped. They're not moving anymore because we're not, getting closer to Europe, or we're not moving away from Europe. It just doesn't make sense. Well, when we're talking about these continents moving, we're talking about millions of years. And the human lifespan, about 100 years, is literally not even a tick on the clock of the geological timescale. So we're talking about very, very long periods of time. So don't think of the continents right now as being stationary, because they're not. They're definitely moving. I'll kind of, ruin that surprise for you right now. Continents move at about the same rate as your nails grow. So we're talking a couple centimeters a year. So if we think about it, we used to have this giant continent called Pangaea. This is Wagner's idea. The continents started to move. Everything got separated. Shouldn't they continue to move? What's going to happen in another 200 million years? So This is a pretty interesting kind of video that it's just on YouTube, so I'm not going to tell you that this is like fact and this is what's going to look like in 250 million years. We can only use kind of models to predict that, but we have a really good idea what it looked like a few hundred million years ago. It's going to continue on, and let's see what maybe Earth will look like in another couple hundred million years. I think the audio on this is... Oh, McDonald's again. Can't get you guys away from advertising. Abby, yeah, people have these really crazy ideas. They never get believed initially just because they change the world, they change the way we think. So, pretty interesting. So, paleogeography, paleo, again, looking back long periods of time. 240 MA to 250, so MA is million years. So this is Christopher Scott's idea. So this is currently, and then it's going back in time. So that's 10 million years ago, 20 million years ago. So it's kind of taking the world and rewinding it. I always get a kick out of India because it's the one that moves the farthest. You can see it over here. So going back in time, 50 million years ago, 60 million, 70 million. So we're talking like dinosaur time now, Cretaceous period. The main dinosaur periods are the Cretaceous and Jurassic, Triassic are kind of big ones too. Avery, will I ever talk about how you think the Earth is created? There's nothing in the course that we discuss that in. I think you learned that in Science 9. There's like a space science section in Science 9. All right, so there's the Jurassic period, Jurassic Park. You guys are familiar with the word Jurassic because of Michael Crichton's book and you guys' knowledge of sort of dinosaurs. All right, so we're 170 million, 180. This is what you can see Pangea starting to form. And of course, this is the entire Earth put onto a flat surface. So it's kind of hard to kind of picture it, but this edge over here would kind of wrap around to this edge and it would all touch. So Triassic, we're talking dinosaurs still. It kind of gets all wonky on the top and bottom again because you end up with these things, this kind of a globe, a three-dimensional sphere put onto a flat surface. So this is basically North America here. You have India down here. Here's Australia. This chunk is Antarctica. And you kind of have Europe and some of Russia, China area. So that is the Triassic period. So we're talking dinosaur sort of time. And then we're going to move forward now. So now we're coming back to present day. So we're going 200 million. It's going quickly. Jump back, 190 million. Everything's kind of starts to separate. And again, this was Wagner's shortcoming. He didn't know how these things moved, but he thought, hey, these things fit together so well. And you can start to see this kind of rift forming, and then Africa and South America will start to separate here in a second, which is pretty cool, down this rift valley. Then Antarctica is going to where it's going. 130 million years ago, you can see India start to form here, and India is going to take a fast lane up to Eurasia here and run into it. So everything's starting to look, about 100 million years ago, it's starting to look like, what we can know now. You see in the middle of North America had a huge sea. It's kind of separate. And then things start to move. So now we're looking like the continents we know. Australia is still kind of touching Antarctica a little bit down here. India is going to run into Asia. It's going to run into it hard. So there you go. That's about 40 million years ago. Everything's looking pretty similar to what you are familiar with today. 20 million years ago. I mean, we're talking about absolutely immense time frames here, but you get the idea. So there you go, there's present day. Now, what's going to happen in the future if things keep moving in the rate they're going? Australia here runs into Eurasia, Antarctica starts to come up, and then things start to kind of go wonky again because of this flat surface issue, but continents keep moving, and eventually you end up with these collisions and really crazy stuff happens. So there you go. That is, the video continues on. I mean, it shows specific areas, but we don't really need to spend time looking at that. So there you go. The continents aren't stationary. They're definitely moving, and they will continue to move long after we're gone. So kind of interesting stuff. So Wagner had all these ideas, couldn't explain how it happened. That was kind of the big problem with Wagner's theory. But as we started to develop more sort of scientific techniques and, we got better at describing what the world was, we got more interested in what was going on around the world, some other things started to be developed. So one thing was earthquakes and volcanoes. Earthquakes and volcanoes don't happen just everywhere. They happen at very specific locations and generally near continent edges. So you can see the red lines and the triangles, the yellow triangles are where volcanoes are, and the red lines are where earthquakes happen, mainly. Main sources of earthquakes and main volcanoes on the planet. And they all happen in these specific areas. So we started to develop better technology to, be able to record the earthquakes, where they're happening, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later next week. But the idea was that we came up with this idea that maybe everything was kind of like fit together on these kind of things, and they called them plates or tectonic plates. This is kind of something, if you think about it, all of these three big puzzle pieces, Africa, South America, North America, fit together. Right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean is a ridge. Now, if you think about it, the distance from Africa to the middle here and North America to the middle, it's a completely equal distance between the two continents. So you end up with this ridge running down the middle of the Atlantic, and we'll talk about what the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is later, but there's this ridge, and it's complete midpoint between all of this stuff. So something's clearly going on here. This isn't super important, but one really cool thing is that this ridge, if you continue on up here, it goes right through the middle of Iceland. And I'll get out of the way here. You can see Iceland behind me. So right through the middle of Iceland, you end up with this ridge. And Iceland's a very volcanic area. This Reykjavik, a couple years ago, one of these big volcanoes erupted in Iceland. So we should theoretically, under the ocean, you can't really see the ridge, but if you were to go to Iceland, there should be a separation between the two continents. So does it exist? So here's Iceland. This is literally a picture of two continents, continental plates. You have Eurasia on one side, you have North America on the other side. So this literally exists. There's this kind of rift that runs through the middle of Iceland. And I'm going to jump. I couldn't get this video to load in. Now it's not even loading at all. That's unfortunate. There we go. Oh, maybe? It's going to make me copy the URL. Okay, I'll do it. I'm not afraid to do it. And of course, right next to the mainland, there's the rift continues on into the ocean. So if you go to Iceland, you can put on a scuba mask, and you can literally go swim between the North America plate and the Europe plate, which is pretty cool. At least I think it's cool. Taylor, we're going to talk about earthquakes next week a little bit, for sure. So we'll spend some time talking about it. And I always joke around when we get to the earthquake section, I'll make the joke today, but when we talk about earthquakes, I've taught the Science 10 course a ton of times now, and every time I teach it, I always joke around. I'm like, well, I always get to talk about a recent earthquake every time we do the earthquake unit. And I'm just like, what a coincidence that every time I make it to the earthquake unit, there's an earthquake somewhere. And this time, yesterday, there was an earthquake off the coast of Malaysia, Indonesia there. And it normally wouldn't have been that big of a deal, but if you remember the big tsunami that happened in 2005, it killed 200,000 people. So there was a major tsunami. It went all the way through India and Sri Lanka and all the way around Thailand, and hundreds of thousands of people died, which normally isn't a big deal. But my brother happens to be in Malaysia right now. So I text him. It was like 10 or 11 at night his time in Malaysia. I'm like, hey man, there's an earthquake and I don't know if there's a tsunami. Are you okay? And he's like, yeah, we didn't feel it. He was actually in Singapore, which is a little further away. But it was just kind of crazy coincidence that we end up with the idea of an earthquake always kind of happening. When I teach the earthquake unit, there's just earthquakes happening all the time. So it's not really that big of a deal, but it happens. So yeah, it's scary to experience one. I've been through one as well. All right, so that was kind of the end of Wagner's sort of theory. He came up with paleoglaciation, fossil evidence, matching puzzle pieces, and he couldn't explain why the plates moved, but there is some more evidence. As technology got better, we got better at measuring things and doing scientific readings and looking at rocks and being able to date how old rocks were and things like that. So the importance here of the North Pole, the tectonic plates meeting to the North Pole. Now, here's the geographic North Pole right here. You maybe see it, some light lines leading to it. The reason I bring it up is every once in a while in the news, somebody, typically Canada, Denmark, or Russia, claims the North Pole is ours. And why does it matter? Well, as climate change kind of takes hold, it's getting warmer and warmer in the summers. Summers are lasting for longer. The polar ice cap that's normally here, it starts to melt. And in a few years, within your lifetime for sure, in the summer, there will no longer be ice at the North Pole. It'll just be a big sea. So what does that mean for us? Well, we can start to explore that area. And of course, what do we need more than anything is sources of energy. So if you can claim that area as being yours, then you are free to use the resources that are there. Yes, Abby, you're exactly right. So you can see that this is Greenland, which is owned by, owned isn't the right word, but it's ruled by Denmark. Greenland's part of Denmark. So it kind of extends, and there's this kind of ridge that goes off it. And then this is northern Canada. You have like Newfoundland here, and then Baffin Island here. So these are all Canadian islands, which are pretty close to the North Pole. And then this is Russia, and their claim to the North Pole is weak because their continental shelf ends a long ways away from the North Pole. But you end up with, this is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. You can see it running right through here, and then it goes right through Iceland, and then down through the Atlantic. So all these little red dots are volcanoes and active seismic events like earthquakes. So that Mid-Atlantic Ridge runs right down through the middle there. Pretty cool. What will happen to all the animals? Yeah, polar bears, they rely on the ice to live, so you'll end up with some bad stuff happening. So the North Pole, well, Mr. Borden, what are you going on about? I'm going to go on to a bit of a tangent here, but hear me out. I think this is pretty cool. Has anybody ever used a compass before? Give me a green check mark if you've used a compass. Looking at a map, or you just had like one to play with as a kid. Just like a toy one, you're not necessarily navigating using one, or maybe you've been on a boat, or maybe you're like grandpa and grandma have an RV with a compass on the dash, or boats typically have compasses. Generally speaking, everybody's come into contact with a compass before. Has anybody ever stopped to think, there's one on your phone, yeah. I actually have one on my watch. My watch has a compass on it. So there you go. Has anyone ever stopped to think about how a compass works? Well, it has something to do with magnets, right? I mean, compass is you have this metal bar that's kind of magnetic and it lines up, and most people don't really think of it any further than that. Magnets, yeah. So you have Earth essentially has this magnetic field. What if I told you that the North Pole, your compass points to north, isn't actually where your compass is pointing? And if I told you even further than that, the North Pole that your compass is pointing at isn't the same place, and it's changed a lot in your lifetime where your compass points. So you see the image here. We have the North Pole. This is northern Canada, so you have Baffin Island here, and these are all the islands up in Canada. In 1850, the magnetic North Pole used to be in Canada, and then it started to move around and did some crazy stuff here in the 1830s, 1950. You guys were probably born around this time. It's moving out towards, the middle of the Arctic Ocean. 2000 was here. 2010, it's here. The North Pole, where Santa lives, is right here, way up here, kind of a little bit out of frame, but you end up with it not being anywhere close to where the magnetic North Pole is. So what's going on? This is kind of like really strange. Why isn't the magnetic North Pole the same thing as the geographic North Pole? So the center of our planet, top and bottom, that Earth rotates on, that's the geographic North Pole. It isn't the same thing as the magnetic one. And the magnetic North Pole is moving, which is really weird. It's not stationary. So what's going on? How do we explain this? I'm going to try to blow your mind one more time if you're not amazed by any of that. Think about this. You guys study magnets in, what grade do you do magnets in? Grade 8, I think, maybe? And you guys all know this. If you have two magnets, a north and a south will attract, the magnetic lines will line up, and a north or a south and a south will repel. So if you have a compass and you have that little red end on your compass and it's pointing north, is the North Pole really a North Pole? Think about that for a second. If the North Pole on your compass is pointing north, shouldn't it be pointing away from the North Pole? I mean, you have two norths, they should repel. So why is the north on a compass actually pointing north? Shouldn't it be pointing south? You have two norths, being attracted to one another. So what does that mean? Somebody please put it into chat. The North Pole isn't a North Pole. What is it? Come on. What is the North Pole? Like up there, north, that way. The North Pole is actually a South Pole. So the North Pole, the magnetic North Pole of our planet, isn't actually north. Because if it was north, all compasses would point to the South Pole. So if those three things don't just, make your mind a little numb, then you maybe need a cup of coffee or something. So sure enough, the North Pole of our planet, so we have the geographic North Pole up here, and then the North Pole, the magnetic North Pole of our planet, is actually a South Pole. So our pole at the north is actually a South Pole. We call it the North Pole just because Europe's in the northern hemisphere, and we put Europe, on the top of a globe. But there's nothing to stop us from flipping the globe upside down, and Australia could be in the northern hemisphere. I mean, it's just a completely arbitrary decision, and because the majority of educated sort of population lived in Europe, so we put that on the top of the globe because it was easier to look at. But there's no reason that it has to be there. So I'm going to get to my point here in a second, just on a bit of a tangent, but I think it's just fascinating. So you end up with this North Pole kind of moving, and it moved really slowly here. You can see like 5-year increments, super slow movement, and then all of a sudden it's starting to speed up. What's going on? Where is it going? You have this 2015, 2020, it's actually going to be pretty close to the North Pole, but not right on it. And if this line continues, I mean, it's been going this way for like 50 years, 100, you should end up with it just continuing to move on. So what's going to happen to that North Pole, do you think? Crazy things. If you've ever used a map before, I don't know if any of you have tried to orient yourselves with a map. If you have a nice, like a proper oriented map, in the bottom, you end up with a little thing, and it shows you the declination of the map, where you are on the planet. If you're using a compass to navigate, your compass points to the magnetic North Pole, which is a problem because that's not actually north, the geographic North Pole. So when you're trying to navigate, all maps, latitude and longitude lines line up with geographic north, not magnetic north. So this is a problem. So if you have a compass and you're trying to navigate, you look at your map and it'll say whenever the map was published, it'll say the declination needs to change. So if you're in the northern hemisphere, if you're, depending where you are, you need to adjust your compass a little bit left or right to point at the North Pole. And this little picture image thing shows you where the North Pole is and how over time where you are. So if you can imagine we live right here-ish. If you wanted to use a compass, this is 1700, so it's a couple hundred years ago. Your North Pole would have been there. You'd have to adjust it by 20 degrees, and then as time went on, now it's 22, now it's 20, 19, 18, 17, and you end up at 0 degrees. So depending on when a map is published, you end up with different degrees as to what you need to change your compass to actually make it point to the geographic North Pole. So everyone has GPS on their phone. Another huge problem. How does GPS work? GPS is based on land, but the North Pole, it moves. So what happens? It's just like there's it's pointing. Your compass is pointing north, Kaylee, but it's not pointing to the North Pole. It's pointing to the magnetic North Pole, which is in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. It used to be in Canada, on one of the islands in northern Canada, at the beginning of your lifetime, but it's moving. Crazy. Can we do anything with this? Yes, we can. I'm glad you asked. But first, we should watch a really cool video about it. I'll try to get the audio loud enough so you guys can hear. History Channel. Oh, how come none of my videos are working? There we go.
Earth's magnetic field is not a stable, static thing. It's changed quite a lot over time.
Like the wine in the glass, Earth's magnetic dynamo can change direction. The North and South Pole can literally flip. Exactly what causes the poles to reverse is not completely understood. All we know is that it happens.
We know that the orientation of the Earth's magnetic poles switches every few 100,000 years.
Ice cores and deep-sea geology reveal evidence that 780,000 years ago, compasses would have pointed south. 50,000 years before that, a compass would have pointed north. It's a recurring pattern on our planet, and it may happen again.
It's almost certain that Earth's magnetic field will change direction again, but we don't know how soon.
In fact, the last magnetic reversal was 780,000 years ago, which is longer than, on average, the field reverses. So in a sense, we're overdue for reversal.
No one is sure how a pole reversal will affect human life. Compasses will point south. Bird migrations might be disrupted. GPS navigation will be affected. But there is a more disturbing consequence. A pole reversal might mean a period where there is a weakened or no magnetic field on the planet.
The problem is that the magnetic field, when it gets weak, it's no longer an effective shield against particle radiation from the sun.
Imagine the Earth as a globe with a plexiglass shield. Only now, the shield is weakened. A high-powered blast from the sun can do immense damage. When the overdue pole reversal takes place, Earth's protective magnetosphere may disappear, leaving the entire planet vulnerable to deadly magnetic storms from the sun.
So the reason, or the way you can tell that that was an American produced video is because they managed to include a gun, and they managed to make you very scared. I mean, if TV isn't trying to make you scared, then what good is TV? But the idea is this. The important things, I know, you need to take everything you see on TV with a grain of salt. If you watch these, shows and they didn't make you scared for your life, then, you wouldn't come back to watch them anymore. So pole reversal happens, and it happens about every 100,000 years, and it flips, and we think it takes about 100 years for the poles to flip. And there is some speculation to think that it's actually happening right now. The magnetic field of the Earth's getting slightly weaker, and that's what happens as the poles flip. You get a weaker magnetic field. They make it sound like it disappears altogether and it just magically reappears. No, it changes, it gets weaker, the field lines get all wonky for a short period of time, but then the field switches and, it's all good again. So there is this idea. How do we know that the pole flips? Do we know? Like, you guys are just sitting here taking this in like, Mr. Borden's a smart guy, he wouldn't lie to us. Abby, that's an amazing question. Does it have to do with climate change? There is evidence to suggest that it does. When that pole flip happens, the magnetic field gets weak, the Earth all of a sudden is receiving more radiation. So what happens as a result of that? Everything from more cloud formation causing the Earth to be colder or receiving more radiation, some areas will get hotter. It happens about every 100,000 years. We haven't seen a pole flip in 700,000 years, so we're definitely due. The world's warming up right now. Is it all connected? Maybe. I don't know. Tell you about 700,000 years ago. So we're way overdue for a pole reversal. Yeah, Alex, it'd be great if we could, but you end up with issues because, well, the Earth is pretty darn big. So nobody asked, how do we know, Mr. Borden? How do we know that the magnetic poles flip? We know it's moving, but how do we know it flips? So if you think about that line down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the mid-Atlantic rift, we call it. As we started to get better in developing technology and recording and, being able to look at rocks, we started doing studies at the bottom of the ocean and on rift valleys, like the one I showed you in Iceland, where you looked at rocks on either side of the rift and you started to look at the, frozen, you think about it, frozen in those rocks is kind of tiny little magnets, if you want to think about it, magnetic minerals. And when the rock was being formed, they line up with the North Pole, and then the rock solidifies. So they get trapped, pointing north. Well, if you go to the middle of a rift, like the Mid-Atlantic one, all of the rock in the middle has North Poles lining up to the North Pole. But if you go a little bit further away from the middle, all of the rock has North Poles facing the South Pole. And you go a little bit further again, and you end up back to the North Pole. And you can measure it, and it's almost completely identical on either side of this rift. So what happens at these rifts is, if you think about Africa and South America being connected, how did they move apart? Something had to fill the gap between those. So magma rises to the surface, it fills in that gap, and it basically starts pushing those plates apart. It's rising, it pushes. So you get these stripes where the magnetic lines are all pointing north, and then they get further away, and then in the middle, all the magnetic lines are pointing south. And the further away you go from the middle, you end up with these bands moving away. So we know that we're 700-ish thousand years away because we can go to the seafloor. We know how fast the continents move. We know how much land gets created each year in the middle of the Atlantic. And we can look how far away from that rift, that literal line that goes right down the middle of the Atlantic, how far away is the magnetic lines pointing north? And the distance away, we can calculate, well, it's moved this far, they're pointing north this far away, so we know that it's about 700,000 years since the last pole reversal. So, some pretty interesting stuff. Yeah, I'll just move on. If you look at the coast, our coast, this is British Columbia here, Vancouver Island, we have there's a plate off our coast called the Juan de Fuca Plate, and there's a rift valley off of our coast. And you can see that we end up with this magnetic striping happening right off of the coast of BC, where on one side of the rock, you get this north pointing north, and you go a little bit further away, you end up with it south, a little further away, And the colors kind of show you that on either side of this rift valley, you end up with these colors. And then these other maps are just kind of showing you what we just looked at, but you can see that the magnetic lines line up on either side. So you end up with this. We make a long strip of straight paper and go all the way around. Would the paper look flat, or would we notice the fact that it's round since it's going around the Earth? I'm not sure I understand your question, Alex. I'm going to read it again here. There was a part of the Earth that was 100% flat. It was like a ring all the way around the Earth, and we make a long strip of straight paper to go all the way around. Would the paper look flat? Well, yeah, yes, it wouldn't actually. You can do this if you go to places like in Utah, I think. You end up with dry lake beds called, you've probably heard of it, Bonneville Salt Flats. It's an old lake bed, and it's completely flat. And you can actually see the curvature of the Earth because it's flat for such a great distance. So if you think about it, really, really flat isn't technically flat unless it's curved because the Earth's a big sphere. So the Earth is very large, very, very big. But there are places on Earth, dry lake beds, really, really flat places where you can physically see the curvature of the Earth. I think that might answer your question. If not, then I'm sorry. All right, so if I just rewind a little bit, we had Wagner, he had these ideas, couldn't explain how it happened. He died, we got better at measuring things. This magnetic striping we found happening at all of these rift valleys all over the planet. So along comes another guy called Harry Hess, and he's like, this Wagner guy was onto something. If I could only explain how they moved, we would take his ideas seriously. So Harry Hess, he came up with this idea that maybe there's magma rising up from under the surface of the Earth. Now, we still to this day have very little understanding of what's actually going on below the surface. We have lots of really good ideas, and we'll look at why those ideas exist in the next couple of classes, but we really don't know what's going on under our feet. The only time we ever, if you think of the Earth's surface, the Earth is massive, and we've only gone down so far. The farthest we've gone down is about 10 kilometers, and we're talking thousands of kilometers in thickness. So we don't have a good idea, but Harry Hess said, what if magma was rising, and that's what was causing the plates to be pushed apart? So you get really hot things rising as, like a hot air balloon floats. Same idea, magma gets hot air rises, and it's pushing up really hard right in the middle of the middle of the Atlantic, and it's pushing these plates away on either side. This is why these plates are moving. So if you think about this used to be like the coast of Africa, this was South America, they used to be touching, this really hot magma risings, pushing them apart, and you end up with these plates separating. So this was Hess's contribution. He said, well, it's possible that, the rock in the middle here, where the middle of the mid-Atlantic ridge is really young. This is really new rock. And then you get a little bit further away, it gets older, and it's the same either side. And they, at this point in time, were really good at measuring the age of rocks using things like radioactive dating and stuff like that. So we could actually go and we could measure the age of the rock. And we noticed it was really young in the middle, really old on the sides. We can also look at how much sediment has fallen. You think of that middle has really fresh rock. It's just being created. And then you end up with no sediment there. It's brand new rock. As you go away, there's more sediment. And you get really close to the continents, you have literally kilometers of sediment after millions of years of that rock being there. So some interesting stuff. Alex, I don't know how hot the center of the sun is. You can look it up. I'm sure it's online somewhere. Then along came John Wilson. And John Wilson's actually a Canadian, and he took this idea of Wagner, and he took the idea of Hess, and he said, let's put them together. These things fit really well together. And he came up with kind of a unifying theory of plate tectonics and geology. So John Wilson was a brilliant man, and he came up with he put the two ideas together, and he said, these match.